was probably only a matter of time, but what's been a wacky day so far for college football and definitely for the Big 12 Conference becomes a day the Mountaineers, the West Virginia Mountaineers, are handed their first loss of the season. WVU losers to Oklahoma State, the 15th ranked Oklahoma State Cowboys, at least coming into the game, but maybe a ranking that is even better than that before this day comes to a close. Oklahoma State winners 27-13 over WVU. The West Virginia Mountaineers now 2-1 on the year. Oklahoma State 2-0 on the season. I'm Mike Asti here on the WVU edition of Pittsburgh Postgame here on Pittsburgh Sports Live amongst our now family of networks. This is our postgame show for WVSportsNow.com. And Tom Bragg, one of our main guys over there at WV Sports Now, to join me here along for the ride as WVU is a loser here today. And honestly, it was a game that their inexperience showed, their youth showed. They really weren't in this game throughout. And despite the fact that Dave Hunziker, who was kind enough to join me for the preview show, he is the voice of the Oklahoma State Cowboys, both in football and men's basketball. I didn't prompt him to clear that up, Tom. I did not prompt him. There was no probing there. He voluntarily put Oklahoma State on upset alert. He was relatively down on the Cowboys because of all their injuries. He took Hubbard out of the Heisman race. And yet they end up winning. He ends up with a long run towards the end, ends up with a 100-plus day. They end up with a pretty convincing victory and could be benefited from that before the end of this day closes. So, Tom, the Mountaineers, they lose. They lose to a good team, though.
Yeah.
That I think maybe showed why they had so many people, especially nationally, predicting them to maybe have a chance at the playoff this year and to have one of the better seasons they've had in a while. They've had a lot of national attention, and for good reason. They aren't incredibly healthy, but there's tons of talent there. They were able to show that off today. The Mountaineers maybe appeared not to be ready for a big game like this, and they just didn't get it done, despite some performances from some of the Mountaineers, like Letty Brown, like Winston Wright.
Mm-hmm.
They performed, but it wasn't good enough. Before we get into things with the intricacies of this game and, of course, the conference implications and even the Heisman race now, what are your initial thoughts on this game for the Mountaineers? They do lose. They actually lose the spread for a while. They were hanging in there, but they end up losing the spread as well. They're 2-1 on the year. They go end up with a game against Baylor next week, but it's the first loss.
Yeah, I think the story of this game today, Mike, for West Virginia was missed opportunities. You know, how many times did the Mountaineers come out to open a series, move the ball well, get down into Oklahoma State territory, and then it all falls apart with fumbles or turnovers or penalties? Just if it could go bad, it was going to go bad once West Virginia got on Oklahoma State's side of the field. And that really kind of put them behind the 8 ball early. They kept it close, really until Hubbard broke that run on, I believe it was a 2nd and 21 to set the final score. It was a 1-score game. If they turn that ball over there, West Virginia's got a chance to go down and tie it. So I think there's some positives you can take out of this, and that they were able to keep it close. You know, hats off to the West Virginia defense. I thought they played really well today. But West Virginia outgained Oklahoma State 353 yards to 342. It was just one of those days where you tiptoed up to the line, but you couldn't quite get over it if you were West Virginia.
That's definitely the case from this game for sure. It was a game that they were hanging in there, but for me, never felt like they were going to win. And yeah, they were hanging in there towards the end. Hubbard's day, despite 22 for 100 of the touchdown, little empty calories there, kind of misleading. Despite
some of that came late.
Over 100. He did have some of those in mop-up duty to kind of secure the game, but he wasn't able to get to 100 in that game against Tulsa for Oklahoma State. So a big deal for him to finally get there in terms of his individual chances this season. But Oklahoma State, despite having question marks at quarterback and injuries, they also had LD Brown with 11 for 103, an average of 4.5 per.
He was impressive today.
Yeah, he actually was really the best running back on the field for Oklahoma State through most of that game. So they were able to really show their worth in the game. Now, does this also speak to, for the Mountaineers, that while there's talent there and they had some performances in this game, they are just not a team built to come back?
I don't know if I'm there yet. There were opportunities. You go down and you get 2 field goals in the second half while you're losing. Those are touchdown opportunities. Those you're a play here or there away from 3 points being 7 points. So I'm not ready to say that they're not built to be a team that plays from behind, but you don't want to settle for field goals all the time. And if that continues, then that's an alarming thing. You got to be able to get into the end zone if you're West Virginia, especially when you look around the Big 12. The whole league is on its head after one day of conference play. If the score holds in Lubbock with Texas Tech leading at Texas, you saw earlier in the day, Kansas State goes out, races, 21-0 against Oklahoma and wins in Norman. I know there's no crowd or a drastically reduced crowd there at the they call it the Palace on the Plains, but still that's a hard thing to do. That's a really good Oklahoma team. I know Spencer Rattler is essentially in his first game as the quarterback and is a redshirt freshman, but look at the talent around him. You should not do that if you're Oklahoma. So it's going to be a weird year in the Big 12. I'm not on red alert after watching this West Virginia performance. I think there's still plenty of spots for wins down the road, but to have it as close as it was coming down the stretch, I think if you're Neil Brown and the Mountaineers, maybe there's a little bit of a sense that you feel like maybe you left one on the board here.
You could maybe feel that way, but even though the Mountaineers were in this game and Oklahoma State was trying to help them stay in the game, really these statistics I think maybe are a little misleading, because I did feel like it was clear in this game that Oklahoma State is the better team, and Oklahoma State's the team that had the hype around them coming into the season. The Mountaineers then will go home in that game against Baylor, then Kansas, Texas Tech, Kansas State, and then Texas. So you look at that remaining schedule there, and that's just the next few weeks, obviously. There are definitely some winnable games in there.
Sure.
But there's going to be some tough games in there as well, because Kansas State just beat Oklahoma. If they can do that, they can beat anybody. Texas will not be easy at all. They're currently a top 10 team. If they lose, that's one thing, but that doesn't mean the Mountaineers can also be losers to them as well, regardless of what happens today. Same thing with that Oklahoma game later on in the season. And Texas Tech, if like Kansas State, if they can prove they can beat Texas, a top 10 team, they certainly can beat West Virginia. So this season that we talked about on the last post-game show, which to really progress for the rebuild process for the Mountaineers needs to result in bowl eligibility, regardless how many bowl games there actually are. It's still up in the air based on what we've seen and based on what we're going to see. But this Mountaineer team, they did have at least a test today. They played well at times. So then this is good for the progression of the program.
Yeah. And the goalposts have moved a little bit with that bowl eligibility thing now that everybody's eligible for a bowl with the news that came out this week, but you still, you want to win more than you lose. I think
the normal bowl eligibility.
Sure. But I think with the way it's set up now, you want to win more than you lose. And this was a step in the wrong direction. If you're West Virginia and that's your goal. Yeah. You talked about the schedule that's coming up. You've got Baylor next week in Morgantown. That's going to be a really tough game. I think Baylor might be, now looking around the Big 12, who knows?
That's a problem.
Yeah, who knows?
Tom, that's what I'm saying, though. Baylor, if they lose to Baylor, then that is a problem in terms of getting to where we said basically legit bowl eligibility, regardless of the overall situation with the pandemic. So that wouldn't make that an issue if they lose.
As you look at it now, the only real Big 12 game they have left that you say they absolutely should win that game is Kansas. I think I think there's some coin flips there, and obviously some that you look at and say, oh, they probably shouldn't win that game, but Kansas is the only one right now that I would say absolutely I think they're going to win that game.
Yeah, no, that's the thing. Kansas is absolutely, and I watched Kansas last week. They lose that game, we're done doing the post-game shows. There's nothing to discuss. No, I'm not being serious, but it'll be a rough road for us.
They might be an abridged version of the post-game show.
It'll be 5 minutes long, and it doesn't matter. They didn't win. They're awful. So you lose that, it's going to really unravel, and that would put a lot more in jeopardy moving forward. But that's probably not going to be a loss based on what I've seen from Kansas.
That's still 2 weeks down the road, though. They've got to digest this game, like you said. There were some positive things to take out of this. I thought the development that we saw of that connection between Jarrett Doege and Winston Wright. Big deal.
I wanted to get to that. I think Winston Wright really emerged in this game. Right.
Big deal. Yeah, I don't know that he's necessarily the most talented or the best receiver on West Virginia's roster, but Doege sure liked to go into him. When they needed a play, that's who he was looking for. So I think that's something to keep an eye on going forward. We talked about the defense, man. What more can you say? They kept him in it right there until the very end.
Yeah.
You really want to get one of those fumbles. And I think they forced 3 fumbles and didn't recover any of them. That flips the game completely if you get just one of those.
And very, very true. The defense, again, the defense has been a defense that, despite all the offseason controversy, that was one unit that I don't think anybody would have been surprised if that unit took a little bit of a dip because of everything they had to deal with. And yet that defense is keeping them into games, especially with a young and experienced quarterback. He definitely seems to have found that favorite target in Winston Wright Jr., 6 for 127 and a touchdown. You don't want him to have too much of a security in that receiver, though. It appears sometimes, which young quarterbacks will do, he's looking for his guy on every single play. And eventually defenses are going to key on it. It's going to make it harder to spread things around. Letty Brown, though, over 100 yards on the ground. So the Mountaineers, a team that could not run at all last year, able to run this year to this point.
That's definitely a good sign when you, after, like you said, what happened last year with the running game. This year, 2 games in, you've had 100-yard rushers in each of them. You had 2 in the first game. You would have liked to seen that today. But
Sure.
back to what you were saying about Winston Wright, though, as far as Daggy keying in on him. He was keying in on him on the important plays, third downs, when they're behind the sticks. But if you look at the stats, Sam James had a catch. Winston Wright had a catch.
Yeah.
TJ Simmons had a catch. Sinkfield, Letty Brown, Bryce Ford Wheaton, Reese Smith, Sean Ryan. He was spreading it around. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing if you're able to spread it around, but you've got your guy, you know who you want to get it to. Because even at some point, the defense for Oklahoma State had to know it was coming because that's who they kept going to. They weren't able to stop it. That's a good sign,
right.
I think.
Right. Yeah. 9 different Mountaineers at my count had at least 1 reception in the game. So that certainly is spreading things around. And that does include Letty Brown and non-traditional wide receivers. Yeah. But Winston Wright has, which actually that's a positive for the team as well, that we wouldn't have known 3-4 weeks ago, that they now have who they feel is their quarterback. They now have, like it or not, in terms of maybe not predicting that to be his talent level, but they clearly have now found the favorite target as the number 1 wide receiver. So those are all positives. Even Letty Brown as a running back, they have the triplets, I guess you could say. Yeah. They have their triplets moving forward. I do want to get to Oklahoma State, though, from a context of the Cowboys, who now, as we're talking again, based on what happens with Texas, and that game should finish before we wrap things up, I'd imagine, they are losing. Oklahoma has already lost. This changes things. That was 2 top 10 teams out of the Big 12 that are gone. Oklahoma State entered the game ranked 15th in the country. Question mark at quarterback. Question mark at their Heisman running back who failed to get 100 last week against freaking Tulsa. A lot of injuries around the offensive line that, again, Dave Hunziker, their play-by-play, told me was going to potentially put them on upset alert. They clearly didn't lose. They won handily. They were able to pull away at the end. They are still not fully healthy, though, but they were a sexy pick coming in the year. It certainly now could propel them to a top 10 ranking based on this win and based on what else is happening in the Big 12 conference.
Yeah, I think if you're Oklahoma State, obviously, maybe you haven't played up to the expectations through the first 2 games for a variety of reasons between the injuries or maybe just trying to gel as a team. But this is a veteran team. This is a team with, like we said, a lot of high expectations, and you just want to weather the storm right now. If you're Oklahoma State, there's chaos going on all around you. Just keep winning if you're Oklahoma State. We talked about how that Texas game
tied
tied now, 40 seconds left, 56-50. So
wow. So we're definitely going to hang here until that game's over.
Shout out to the overbetters out in Lubbock today.
Yeah, that also might have game of the day right now.
Yeah, there's been some good ones going on around the country too, but 56-56, man, that's Big 12 football, baby.
Yeah, you have Mike Leach out there throwing it more than has ever happened before in the SEC today. So that's entertaining. But yeah, you get 56-56 as that final minute churns there. 2 Texas schools. You have that rivalry. Texas Tech would love to knock off their big brother of sorts. And that game would really be a problem for Texas, knowing going into that game that Oklahoma had already lost. So there was a lot on the line for Texas to be a top 5 team with that win in all likelihood. And this is not the time to lose because you have a couple weeks and then you're going to see the Big 10 and the Pac-12 after that. These other conferences are going to be playing football. So there's more teams vying for these rankings.
A loss for Texas evens that playing field too. If you're a game up on Oklahoma going into Red River, then you're a game up on Oklahoma going into Red River. And now suddenly you can you can lose that game. And we've seen time and time again, Texas have great seasons that they kind of get derailed by a close loss to Oklahoma, or even when they beat Oklahoma, they turn around and lose to Kansas. Kansas is the one that always seems to get Texas, aren't they? But it's just weird day in the Big 12. Not such a weird day in Stillwater, but lots to digest from this game still. I think there's just a lot going on. It's so early, everything's so new. We're getting our first look at so many things that just a lot to get into. The show could probably go on for hours if we wanted.
We could. we are not going to do that.
No, we're not going to. But
we could definitely do that. Yeah, Mike Asti got to eat dinner at some point today.
Yeah. The dog's going to want to walk at some point.
Yeah, we're not going to do that. But I will say, and that's Tom Bragg. I'm Mike Asti here on the West Virginia Mountaineers edition here of our post-game show here on Pittsburgh Sports Live, and of course WV Sports Now. Find us at WV Sports Now on Twitter, also at PGH Sports Live on Twitter, and both of us, our names are there. These are easy Twitter accounts for all of you, so feel free to click the follow button and search us over there on Twitter. But I do also want to get your thoughts before we get the rest of the game, and then even what's going on in the Big 12, that at that point I feel like should be maybe hopefully over for us out there between Texas and Texas Tech. Hubbard's day, his Heisman candidacy, is any of that still a thing? Dave Hunziker seemed to kind of eliminate that as a possibility. Granted, it's nothing that he's doing wrong, but his offensive line and all the injuries didn't really help the cause this year. Those numbers last year were off the charts for a guy that was not healthy. He was not at 100%, 2,000 plus rushing yards. Those were some off the chart numbers that you could argue are underrated in historic context for college football and what he's getting talked about. He had the hype coming into this year, failed at 100 against Tulsa. That's a team you got to rack up the numbers against if you want Heisman candidacy. Gets over 100 in this one, has a touchdown, 22 carries on this day. But he wasn't really even the best running back performance of the day in this game. What are your thoughts on him? Is he still in that Heisman race as an outsider? And is he still the driving force for Oklahoma State moving forward?
I think he's still a Heisman candidate. He's got the name brand recognition. Like you said, coming off of last year, they didn't lose. That's what really will ding you on the Heisman candidacy. Maybe you don't have a great game and your team loses. Well, what happened to this Heisman Trophy candidate? They won. It's all right.
For a non-quarterback, though, he does need the numbers there.
Yeah, he needs to start racking up the numbers, but they're 2 games in. So
right.
I'm not hitting the panic button on the Chuba Hubbard Heisman candidacy just yet, but he needs to get it going if he wants to stay in there and get it, and
sure,
be it in New York or wherever they end up doing it at the end of the year. LD Brown, though, adds another aspect to this Oklahoma State offense that maybe people weren't aware of or weren't ready to. What's a good way to put it? He adds just another dynamic to this offense that people weren't game planning for, weren't considering going into the year, just because you had Chuba Hubbard. He ran for 2,000 yards last year. Why would you give the ball to anybody else?
Right.
But now you see why. 103 yards on 11 carries. He broke that long touchdown, 66-yarder, I think it was. And now all of a sudden, you talk about maybe WVU is developing some triplets in their 3. Well, they've got quadruplets at Oklahoma State. If you throw in a healthy Spencer Sanders with 2 running backs and Tylan Wallace, that's tough to beat. So I think it's not. I think maybe you're a little concerned that Chuba Hubbard's not performing up to these crazy expectations that everybody's placed on him if you're Oklahoma State. But at the same time, you got to feel good about having 2 guys you're comfortable giving the ball to.
Yeah, and LD Brown, 11 carries, 103 yards and a touchdown. You had the nail on the head there, 66 yards exactly for that longest run. Hubbard 22, 101, 1 touchdown. I mean, LD Brown averaging 9.4. And he does have the 66-yarder, so that's going to be misleading in terms of the overall yardage per carry. But still, he's adding a dimension to that offense that it was also odd to talk to somebody that's covered Oklahoma State and called those games for so long. And the conversation then kind of blended in how this is an odd Oklahoma State team. This is an Oklahoma State program that has Dana Holgorsen and been predicated on offense and airing the ball out and throwing tons. That's not this Oklahoma State team, but they might be better equipped to have a run this year and maybe a safer team, despite also the mistakes we saw with Hubbard with the fumbles. But if he can fix that, they might be a safer team moving forward based on what else is happening in college football. Tom Bragg, Mike Asti here on the WV Sports Now edition of the Mountaineers postgame show here on Pittsburgh Sports Live. Find all our postgame coverage over there at WVSportsNow.com. Cody Nesper right now putting all that content up on the site for you. Any other thoughts on this game in particular, on the Mountaineers game in particular? They're now 2-1 on the year. Obviously, Baylor is the next opponent, then Kansas. The schedule does have those winnable games, but also are going to have some tough games as well. And while the Mountaineers maybe have had triplets emerge, I also think defensively there's some standouts there as well. So I think people need to remember, this is still the second year of Neil Brown, and there's still a rebuilding program, but there are pieces now there for this program.
Yeah, I think the defense is fine. Obviously, there's guys that are going to step up. Hope Van Darius Cowan ends up being okay. I saw that he went out with an injury, looked kind of bad at one point. And honestly, I got caught up in following the rest of the game and didn't notice if he was back in the game and never heard his name called. So hopefully, if you're West Virginia, he's back, because that guy is fast when he's out there. But Tony Fields, the graduate transfer linebacker from Arizona, might be the best defender outside of the defensive lineman for West Virginia. I thought the Stills brothers had good games along the defensive line. Alonzo Adai, the defensive back, he hit a guy. So I think somebody on Twitter said that they felt that hit in Morgantown, and I believe it, man. He lit that guy up. The offensive side of the ball, I think if you're Neil Brown and the offensive coaches, you got to look at what worked in this game and what didn't and why it didn't. Jared Dagey throwing the deep ball today looked bad. I know the pass protection was not good. He was under a lot of pressure, but sometimes he had time, and you're seeing balls come off his back foot. The deep ball's kind of fluttering. It wasn't Austin Kendall bad from last year, but it wasn't good on that deep ball. But when he started going underneath, the quick routes, the slants, finding the running backs out of the backfield, that's how Winston Wright made his money. That's how Winston Wright got his yards today. Got those.
Yeah, let's not make this a viral program.
Right. We would enjoy the hits, but for the good reasons. But those were coming on slants. His long touchdown, I think he caught it 5-6 yards from the line of scrimmage on a quick slant, beat a defender, and he was off. And that seemed to be what was working for West Virginia when they were moving the ball well through the air. The running game, you like what you see out of that, but you got to be able to convert third downs. You got to be able to turn field goals into touchdowns, and West Virginia just was not very good at that today.
Yeah, but does that kind of speak to what I mentioned earlier, that the team is maybe not built to come back? Because if the issue is the deep ball, if the issue is creating big plays through the air, and yes, they can dink and dunk, and yes, they can kind of give you a West Coast offense feel, which maybe is the bread and butter to win in the future. That might be more of a Neil Brown offense. That's fine if that's what they can do, but that could put them in an issue of coming back in games, and they're going to face some powered offenses later in this season.
Well, I think with the way the defense played, if you can keep it within a score or two, with, a relative, I mean, if you're down in the last couple minutes, it's going to be tough trying to throw the deep ball. But
for sure,
as far as if you find yourself
if they get down by 2 touchdowns in the first quarter, is that a problem?
It can be, but I think with the way the defense has played so far, that
it shouldn't unravel. It shouldn't be worse.
Right, okay. Right. If you can keep it within a couple scores in the first half, I think they got a chance. But that's, again, I think 2 games in.
Right.
One of them was against Eastern Kentucky, and the second one was against a pretty good Oklahoma State team. I don't think there's reason to ring the alarm for anything that you're seeing from West Virginia right now. Now, are there some things that concern you that you have to go back and work on in practice? Absolutely. After what you saw today. But I'm not ready to, throw the baby out with the water. I'm not ready to do any of that yet. I still think this can be a pretty good West Virginia team, but there are some things that they absolutely have to fix if they're going to do that.
Yeah. And the Mountaineers 1-1 on the season there earlier. I said 2-1, but 1-1 on the season. Don't want to give them the Baylor win yet, because as obviously that Baylor team certainly could sneak up on WVU. Maybe give them the Kansas win, but that's pretty much all that is secured the rest of the way. Yeah, we will see. Oklahoma State, though, does get their second win of the year as their season started a little late, and they had that win over against Tulsa, which, again, you think what you want from Tulsa. They hung in that game through most of it, so maybe we haven't seen the best of Oklahoma State yet.
I don't think we have.
And that's a top 15 team that may very well be a top 10 team before this night closes, at least where they should be ranking-wise. Any thoughts on how this will shake out? Oklahoma losing, bad loss as the number 3 team in the nation. Still a very talented team that certainly could run the table but an inexperienced team, a younger team than they're normally used to putting out there, but still inexcusable. You just can't lose that game, especially allowing as many points as they did and blowing a lead like they did to Kansas State. Texas in this barn burner that I'm seeing now is an overtime.
Yeah, they're in
Texas
overtime
Tech.
now.
Yeah, so that either way, really, even if they win, you don't feel good about that game. But as you mentioned earlier, you just want to survive in advance, almost March Madness style.
Yeah.
If they get out of it with a win, they're going to still stay in the top 10. If they
nobody saw 56 points from Texas Tech coming. Get your win there.
Yeah. This isn't Texas Tech from 10 years ago.
No.
Crabtree and company. They certainly were not predicted to throw that many points up on the board. But you have Oklahoma State with a victory here in this one over the Mountaineers. They were top 15 coming into the game. They should at least secure that officially, if not go in the top 10. How much do you think the Big 12 has shaken up the college football universe here today? LSU also loses at number 6 in the country.
Is that final now?
Yeah, I saw they lost that game, and that's obviously the defending national champions. To their credit, they don't have Joe Burrow. He's in Cincinnati. This is a young team as well.
Joe Burrow or or any of their receivers or their offensive coordinator, this is not last year's LSU team.
It's a totally different team. They are full-on rebuilding, but they were still a rebuild process. They got credit for a top 10 ranking, and they're still a good team with talent there. Nonetheless, they are. I
believe their defensive coordinator's coaching Baylor tonight. So
right. So
a little bit different look from the Tigers this year.
So you have that game as well. You have that shaking things up as well. Still some games later on in the evening that could shake things up. But what did the Big 12 do today? I mean, they're the talk of the college football, not necessarily positive for the conference, but how much do they shake things up? Oh, especially Oklahoma's loss.
No, you a Simpsons guy at all? When Sideshow Bob continues to step on the rakes over and over and over again. That was the Big 12 today. I saw Texas just went up 63-56. I think they got the ball first though. Okay. So Texas Tech will get a go at it. But yeah, I think they shot themselves in the foot today. Their national reputation is in the garbage right now. It's unfortunate for them that the Big 12 and the Pac-12 aren't playing yet, just for the possibility that maybe somebody would screw up as bad as they have and take some of the heat off of them. But yeah, the Big 12 is in a bad spot right now. You expect better spot than they were 10 minutes ago if Texas is able to hold on here. But Oklahoma taking a loss this early, the way they did, and they're supposed to be the team in the Big 12 every year. They're the ones that have been to the playoffs every year from the Big 12 since the playoff has been a thing. So it's not good. It's not. I think I tweeted earlier, if you're the Big 12, after what you saw out of Oklahoma, you really want Texas or Oklahoma State / WVU, whoever comes out of that, to end up being really awesome this year, because Oklahoma has problems. If you give up a lead the way they did to that Kansas State team, bad news. Now, credit to Kansas State. That freshman running back they had, he was doing work today. They were able to come back, got big plays, blocking punts, turning them into touchdowns, making the plays they needed to make down the stretch to win that game. That's a sign of good coaching. Chris Kleiman, great coach out there at Kansas State, great pedigree coming from North Dakota State. That guy just wins football games. You think with that win today, it's just a matter of time before Kansas State gets pretty good again. Maybe not playoff or winning the league good, but they're going to be a threat in the Big 12 before too long under Kleiman, I think.
And the same thing could be said about Baylor and some of these other programs that are emerging.
Baylor's got a great quarterback, great situation down there. We'll see what Dave Aranda can do with them, because obviously Matt Rule was very, very successful running his system at Baylor. So we'll see if it translates over. But gosh, I'm kind of gobsmacked with where the Big 12 goes from here, because
I like that term, gobsmacked. I don't think that's going to be on any other broadcast today, so I'm a fan of that one, gobsmacked. That's a West Virginia term right there.
I'm a writer by trade. I can pull the words out. I don't always necessarily articulate them well, but I can use them well sometimes, though.
No, that fits. Gobsmacked. My fiance was looking up adjectives for writing a recommendation for a student. She's a teacher, and I didn't see gobsmacked on her adjective list. The ones I gave her also didn't include a gobsmacked, and I feel like I can provide the adjectives as well here as a word. I like that.
We'll get her the old hillbilly thesaurus.
I'll try to work her in gobsmacked and see if she can help that kid get in any college. It might hurt the recommendation potentially. Who did you get to write this? Where are they from? The Mountaineers 1-1, the Oklahoma State 2-0 on the season. WVU losing 27-13 to the Oklahoma State Cowboys, who came into the game ranked 15th. But as we're discussing here, Tom Bragg here, Mike Asti on the WVU edition of Pittsburgh Postgame here on Pittsburgh Sports Live, that maybe that could change much for the better. So I guess that also then lends me to talk about the implications overall, but which one of these Big 12 teams has the best shot at being in the playoff? Oklahoma loses, but they were number 3. They still have tons of talent. The college football world's going to love them. So if they win out, they certainly still have a chance. Texas, the same thing. They're going to play each other later on in the season. That'll be a big rivalry game and big implications. Oklahoma State, despite the injuries, feels like they now have a good inside track if they can keep winning as well. I doubt anybody else in conference really has a shot, but who knows how things will work in college football this year. But who from the Big 12 has the best chance? Or are you kind of in your gut thinking the Big 12 is getting left out this year? Because if Oklahoma and Texas, who are the darlings, lose again, a 2-loss Big 12 team probably is going to have a rough go of it, because they're probably going to want to try to at least slide in one Big 10 team because they're playing. Certainly the SEC is going to be well represented. There's not that many spots.
Right. Only 4 spots this year. I think it's Texas right now, up 63-56 on defense, 3rd and 14 right now.
Yeah, if they lose this game, you might have a new answer.
They lose this game, then it's Oklahoma State. But right now, I think it's Texas. I think, again, the problems that Oklahoma showed today, Texas has a veteran group. They've got a great quarterback in Sam Ehlinger, despite his distaste for the Mountaineer fans and the Mountaineer players in general, maybe, but he's no denying that guy is really good. Talking about Chuba Hubbard as Heisman candidates, Sam Ehlinger right there too. I think the quarterback of Texas, that's the best team in the Big 12. I think that guy's got a shot at the Heisman.
Yeah, quarterback of Texas, I think has a shot. Absolutely,
yes. So, but yeah, to answer the question, I think it's Texas, then Oklahoma State. Both of them would come at it today 1-0 in the league, which you can't say about Oklahoma.
So one loss is moving you off the Oklahoma wagon. I understand it's not a good loss, but this is the number 3 team in the country. The college football world loves them, and there's still tons of talent there. They've done this before, where they lost early in the season to Kansas State.
I'm talking about right now as it stands. Who do I think is in line for the playoff spot from the Big 12? I think it would be Texas, then Oklahoma State, then Oklahoma. Now that flips around as teams start moving around. And I was an AP voter for a couple of years, and I never had a problem wiping my previous ballot out and not playing that, well, we'll shuffle a team up a couple spots because they won and down a couple spots because they lost. Right. You kind of do that with the top 10 or so, because those, you got a pretty good feel for those. But 23 or 10 through 15 or 11 through 15 or 25 rather, I can get the words right eventually, Mike, I swear. But 11 through 25, you can
put
wipe
the pressure on you when you're
you can wipe that out. And I think that's how I'd treat this next week. You know, you look at the teams that would still be undefeated in the league. They obviously would have the better shot. You weight that a little bit with how good you think they are, rather the teams with losses are. And Oklahoma obviously is probably going to be at the top of that list until some of these other teams start catching losses. But yeah, I think Texas has the inside track right now. 4th and 14 for Texas Tech coming up. So play of the game coming up here in Lubbock. But I'm watching a game tracker. I'm not watching the live video.
Okay.
I was waiting to see if it updated, because it final score 63-56. Texas wins in overtime.
So they managed to come out of there with a win. Yeah. And certainly Oklahoma could very easily, nobody would be shocked if Oklahoma still would beat Texas, because
wouldn't shock me at all. But like I said, there's some problems with that Oklahoma team that I think Texas is equipped to take advantage of when they play. Now is that how it'll play out? Who knows? That game is so weird every year, but yeah, I think this is a year that Texas might be the favorite going into that game.
Yeah. Now it does bring up, and this is a topic that is discussed ad nauseum every year, but this is a different year. This is a different year, to be fair. So maybe it actually holds more legitimacy this year than even in past years. As we mentioned, there's a lot of teams vying for the college football playoff. There are only 4 spots. You're basically just playing conference schedules in terms of what really matters, despite those early week games. This season, more than others, is really going to eliminate the UCFs of the world, because there is no way to get an out of conference legit top 15 opponent on that schedule.
You've got to go unbeaten and beat people by 40 every
and
week.
even more so.
Even then, it's going to be tough.
Yeah, it probably even then wouldn't happen, because as much as I've killed UCF for not having that top 15 win a couple years ago, even when they claimed it, there's not even a chance for that on the schedule this year. So they really don't have a shot this year.
The UCF people and my Twitter mentions go back decades, buddy. Back when they were in Conference USA with Marshall, they had fun.
Yeah,
with us.
seriously,
So,
if I tweet UCF, I could say something positive, and I got 16 people sending me death threats. But I think my face on a dartboard down there.
Oh man, when I was the AP voter last year, I had them in my top 25. It was the week of the Kansas game when West Virginia went to Lawrence last year.
Right.
I had them in my top 25, but I had them ranked lower than any other voter in the AP poll. And there was a radio show, and I forget the name of the show, but it was based out of Orlando. And this guy was killing me in email, like, "Come on my show, coward, explain your ballot. And I just brushed it off and ignored it. But that day is the day that the Pitt Panthers beat UCF in last year. So I emailed the guy back during the game, was like, "Hey, you want me to come on the show next week? I'll gladly explain my UCF rating." He never got back to me, though. It was weird.
Right. Yeah, that is odd how that works out there. Yeah, that is odd. Yeah, but I mean, again, the schedule's not been tough enough, but in the recent years, no matter what those fans want to say, it certainly hasn't been in comparison to some other schools, even schools that had losses. If they would play a schedule that would even be West Virginia's schedule all the way through, they're not going to go undefeated. But we can digress, because it doesn't matter. They're not going to really be in that conversation this year. I don't.
I think, and we really don't know what kind of weight they're going to give to these Big 12 and Big 12, Big 10 and Pac-12 schools.
Well, sure. And
once we get to that point, and
the Big Ten is playing before the Pac-12, and I would also say that even without COVID, the Pac-12 was looking at probably a down year, so they weren't normally going to be in there as much this season anyway. The Big Ten has Ohio State, they have Penn State, there's even Michigan. They're going to be brought up in the conversations, and they're going to be talked about national TV. Urban Meyer's bringing Ohio State up as his national championship pick already, so they're going to be in there.
The hell you say? Urban Meyer's picking Ohio State? I'm stunned.
But they're going to be those Big Ten schools are going to be the schools that can really upset the apple cart, because as I even discussed on the Pitt post-game show with Mike Vukovican, that Pitt, who probably is going to really move up in the rankings, they're legit going to hold a top 25 spot now after beating Louisville. And
it was good win for Pitt today. That's not a great Louisville team, but it's a sneaky good one. They've got some good players. You got to win those games.
Yeah, and they did, and they have 2 winnable games coming up. So Pitt very realistically could be 5-0 on the season. That's certainly going to hold. Maybe with how things go, that could be a top 15 Pitt team, depending on what they do against Miami. We'll see as they move forward. We might even do one of these post-game shows with the 3 of us, including Mike, because of the time schedule being the same. So that'll be interesting.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah, but the point of it is that, and what he even brought up, that if Pitt has any hiccups, even if their only losses to Miami after the first 8 weeks of the season, if Ohio State's 3-0, then that could hurt the Panthers in those non-elite programs that are winning but aren't necessarily dominating in terms of these rankings, because they're going to want to include some of these Big Ten schools. It's not just going to be all it is right now.
Absolutely.
So it's going to be change. So my question, where I was going to go, though, is because of all of this going on and the weirdness of this season and so many teams involved and just playing at different times of the year, so making it even more difficult to rank teams, is this the season that maybe you would have preferred to see an expanded playoff, maybe to have more legitimacy, because the team that's ranked 5th in the country maybe could have more of an argument this season than even in past years, because maybe that 5th ranked team, if it is a Big Ten team, then the Big Ten people are going to say, well, damn, it's not our fault that we didn't play the first month and a half of the season. You had us behind because of the rankings. It might even have more controversy than normal. And maybe you could have got away from that by expanding it to even at least 8 schools. Would you have been okay seeing that this year, even if we didn't get that in past seasons?
Yeah, I think 8 teams would be fine. I think if there was ever a year to open it up and just run it like 1AA does, or FCS, excuse me, then this would be the year. You still do the
pro sports are doing it. The pro sports are allowing half the damn league in.
Right. And if you keep your playoff committee and you do all that the same, but instead of 4 teams, you do 16 teams. And nothing is normal about the schedule or the timeline about this season. And that's always kind of been one of the things that gets thrown out there is all these kids have school, or they've played X amount of games in X amount of weeks.
School.
Well, that's not going to be the case this year. And I think there's a lot of I think it was a good point that you and Mike made about what happens in November if you've got some 6-1, 7-1,
like non-elite programs.
strong Power 5 teams like a Pitt
right.
or like a Baylor or somebody,
right.
and they're a top 10 team based on who's been playing.
Yeah.
And the first game out of the gate, Ohio State beats Nebraska by 70. It's happened before. But there's going to be some people that look at that and go, oh, well, Ohio State's better than Pitt, obviously, or Ohio State's better than Baylor, obviously, and they start keying them in. I'd be real curious to see how the playoff committee handles that. The rankings, the AP, the coaches poll, I think you're going to see a lot of that once the Big Ten teams especially get back into it. But I'll be very curious to see how the playoff committee handles it, because it's a little bit different makeup than the AP voters.
Well, right. And we've seen that when there has been an AP national champion that didn't coincide with who college football or the NCAA or the BCS or any of these systems deemed to be their college football champion. Certainly the college football playoff has even had that, as we just went through that whole UCF conversation, and whether it wasn't necessarily an AP issue, but just there's been controversy all the way through. Yeah. There would be controversy this year, regardless of a pandemic. People, no
matter how many teams you let in, Mike, 16, if it's 2 in the BCS, if it's 4 in the college football playoff, if it's 16 in 1AA, if it's 32 in the NHL, then whoever's 33 is going to have a complaint, or 17 or 9 or 3.
So that's
there's no perfect way to do it. You're going to get that no matter what. But I think, like I said, if there was ever a year to open it up, this would be the year. I think
I don't know if personally I would have wanted it open up to 16, because personally, even in the pro leagues, I understand the pandemic. I do think it's watering it down a little bit when like Major League Baseball is opening up to almost half the league. I think in some senses that's a bit much. However, I understand why it's happening this year here during the pandemic season. But certainly 8. I think as a compromise, 8 could have definitely happened this year. I wouldn't mind seeing 8 happen permanently. I don't know if I want 16 permanently, but I think 8 is a reasonable situation, because then, as much as we all know that, wow, yes, you could just purely take all the conference champions, but it's different in college football, where the number 2 team in the SEC could easily be better than the conference champion of the Pac-12. The schedules don't always work. They don't all play each other.
The playing field's
teams.
Not level. In the NFL, at least, there's kind of a uniform schedule policy. Like, some teams are going to have tougher schedules than others, but it all kind of works out in the end. In college football, there's so many different variables. Like, how do you know how good, we keep picking on UCF, but how do you know how good the American Conference is with UCF coming out of it? But you've got, say, like a 2 or 3 loss Georgia team that you go, oh, they would go undefeated and score 100 points every week if they played in that conference. But it's an apples and orange comparison that's so hard to make.
You get into the situation where it really does depend on the difficulty of your conference, and it almost seems like the best path to be a national champion, which kind of what the ACC did, and Florida State certainly did this years ago, where you have a conference that's legit, it's good, but it's not too good, where it's hard to run through.
And one juggernaut.
Right. So like
that's what Clemson's doing right now. You said Florida State. Clemson's doing it right now.
Clemson's absolutely doing it right now. So that definitely does bring in that conversation, because when you have a Big Ten or an SEC that brings 2, 3, 4 top 15 or top 25 teams a year, then UCF fans would always tell me, sure, we don't have we don't have a top 15 out of conference game, and we only play at a top 25. A Pitt or a Memphis are our best out of conference games.
But we beat Tulane by 40 though.
Well, yeah, you get that, and then you also get Alabama's playing the Little Sisters of the Poor. It's like, yes, they are, but then they're playing LSU the week after, who's 5th in the country. So
LSU, Florida, Tennessee, and Georgia in back-to-back weeks after that. So yeah, they can play ULL for homecoming, guys. That's how it works.
Right. So like, that's what I'm saying. Like, when you have a conference that is so just a gauntlet, it's going to be more difficult than if you throw in that one out of conference game that might at that point be legit, whereas the other ones are not. But we won't make this a UCF bash fest, but I don't mind it, because I think we could. They deserve it. I think you and I maybe are the number 1 on their hit list. So feel free to.
I don't know about that. It's a pretty long list, but we're probably both on it though.
Yeah, that's very, very true. But nonetheless, I think it's definitely going to be interesting, and I think that the way things have worked with rulings, certainly in these other sports, Major League Baseball did not announce the way they were going to do the draft until a week before the Pirates, for example, clinched being the worst team in baseball and getting the first overall pick. So they could come out next week and say, we're going to go to 8 teams. It wouldn't. They. It's not like it's a closed door issue. I do think that even if they don't want to do it permanently, this year would make sense because as much as you're always going to have the 5th team or the 17th team or the 9th team complaining, it's going to be hard this year when you have, for example, you talked about with Pitt, August or October 24th, Pitt has Notre Dame. That is a week after Miami. Pitt could if they beat Miami, they could very well go into that game being a top 15, top 12 team, top 10 team in the country if there's some
Miami's pretty good too. That might be, I mean, you might be 2 top 10 teams there.
Well, right.
Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
You might be, but my point is that say if Pitt beats Miami, that's going to be a secure quality ranking for Pitt.
Mm-hmm.
But then if they go lose to Notre Dame, which could happen, do they drop significantly? Because as you mentioned, Ohio State, who's going to open up their year, just trounces teams and say maybe Penn State, Michigan, maybe they do the same thing, maybe Wisconsin too. Then that's going to be a thing. And then the week after that, they're going to have a couple games under their belt. If those teams keep on winning, it'll bring up that conversation. So maybe you do need to expand it to be able to include mostly at that point, you'll get the conference champions. You'll be able to include a conference runner-up. So if you have the second best team in the SEC being way better than a conference champion, they can also be included. And you might even have room for somebody else later down the line, even though obviously not this year for that to be a UCF or somebody like that.
Yeah, well, if you're going to 8, then maybe, and you're including all the conference champions, maybe you don't include all the conference champions. You give the group of 5,
right?
There, or the Power 5, excuse me. And then out of the group of 5, if you've got an undefeated or a 1-loss team, that's when the committee comes in. That's when you start figuring out, do they deserve a spot at the table? And honestly, the answer might be no. It very well likely could be no. But I think they've got to be in the conversation at that point if they've got the 1-loss record at that point.
I think you got to be undefeated still. But if you're undefeated, they certainly are in the conversation. They certainly would have been there a few years ago when they claimed their fake national title. If there was 8. They would have absolutely had an argument. Although what they would have said even 3 years ago. If they got in as the 8th ranked team, they would have said, nobody else here is undefeated. Why are we 8th? We should have been 1. They would have wanted the number 1 seed based on record, or at least the 3 or something that.
The thing about national championships, Mike, is if you want to be the best team, you're going to have to play somebody good at some point, right, whether that's in your conference schedule or your bowl game or in the playoffs.
Or at least, Tom, as we round things out here, at least you're going to have to do that nowadays. I mean, I will say, and this I
was going to say, you can kind of tell how the West Virginia game went, and that we have not talked about West Virginia in like 20 minutes now.
Well, I was going to say, we're going to round it out with that, but I also was going to mention here, because this is going to be on WV Sports Now, despite our marriage with all these other outlets, to not make this too much of, well, Pitt could get screwed in the rankings later on and have some Mountaineer fans upset. I will also add this, that you need to be able to beat the best and legitimize yourself to a national title nowadays, for sure. But back in the day, you could just claim a title 30 years later when people who were on the national championship team weren't even alive anymore and say that was the national champion. That's been done by, say, the Pitt Panthers in the past. In fact, 8 of their 9.
Oh, open it up.
30 years later.
If schools are going to do it, every school should do it.
Right. Well, okay.
You got an undefeated. You got an undefeated season. Congratulations, Marshall. You won a national championship in 1999. Tulane did it the year before in 98.
Well, Tom, you know how we always talk about WVU being one of the winningest programs without ever one of the winningest programs ever, a top 15 ever. They are the winningest program without a national championship of all time. 1922, they were undefeated.
National championship for the Mountaineers in 1922.
Okay,
then.
So then they're no longer without a national championship.
We claimed it right here. That's legitimate. That's as legitimate as a lot of these other ones that get claimed. Yeah, so congratulations.
We are both credentialed. We're both in the Football Writers.
We'll get a socially distanced parade set up for High Street next week.
Yeah. So, and we'll get some grandsons. Any grandson of the 1920
the 100-year anniversary is coming up in 2 years. Start planning for that weekend. Big time in Morgantown.
So there it is. So yeah, we'll leave it with that. Any final thoughts though, Tom? Because that, is where we're here to do it as we could have this trek along as it did here. The Mountaineers now 1-1. Oklahoma State 2-0. WVU losing 27-13. Any final thoughts on WVU's performance today? Obviously, we mentioned in the beginning there, if you didn't want to hear all the UCF or the rest of the talk, scroll back to the beginning of the show. But there were some bright spots for the Mountaineers. Certainly creating this offensive triplets, the defense, they're standing up again. I think Neil Brown even showed some gutsiness with his play calling that fans will like. But it's not a win. Next week, in question, coming up in question, the conference in doubt. So another issue would be is if you lose some of these games, it's going to look worse than it would have been even a week ago because they have now lost these games or played tough games to this point. So again, there's some reason to be concerned, but thoughts on the Mountaineers moving forward and on this game? Any final thoughts?
Lots to build on, but definite concerns. The pass protection, number one amongst those. I think Jarrett Doege was good when he had time, but I think at some point he was just concerned that he wasn't going to have time from the moment he got the ball in his hands.
I think that was also underrated from the running game being so bad last year, and they were bad. They were bad because the offensive line was god-awful.
Yeah, they weren't very good last year. They had good tackles, but the middle three were not good last year.
Yeah.
I think they're improved this year, but I think center's a tough spot. I didn't think Chase Barrett played especially well today, and Zach Frazier came in and played a little bit and kind of got pushed around too, had some blow snaps. I believe the scoop and score that Oklahoma State had after they hit Doege and he fumbled, they took it back for a touchdown. That play started with a low snap from Zach Frazier. I'm not saying it's his fault, but that was sort of the first in a line of terrible things that happened to West Virginia in about a 5-second span. So you got to clean that up. And it's just the second game though. So you got to clean it up. Basically, it would be my message to the team at this point. You didn't play terribly. You didn't play great. Clean it up. Hope some bounces go your way and get ready for Baylor.
Yeah, get ready for Baylor. And we will be previewing Baylor all coming up this week here on WV Sports Now.
All kinds of stuff, man. We blow it out this week.
We definitely will. And that is going to be a game that is certainly in doubt potentially for the Mountaineers. And that could be a game that for Baylor could really move them into a larger light of their program if they can get a win. So that's a big deal for both of those two programs.
The way things went today, though, let's let them get through Kansas first before we count any chickens about how good this Baylor team coming in is, because
it's true.
I had Kansas State, Texas Tech, and Kansas pegged as the three worst teams in the league before today. Don't know about those predictions anymore, so we'll see. We'll see.
I got two words for you. Coastal Carolina. I mean,
oh man, Kansas is bad. They were bad before Kansas, before Coastal
came
in there. I'm
Coastal,
secure. I feel good about that one, but the way things have gone today, though, wow.
Yeah, they were so bad the Coastal beat them back-to-back years. It actually was funny during the graphic of that game that I was some reason I don't understand why I was up at 2 a.m. watching last week. I just couldn't stop watching.
It was on. That's why
I was captivated by this Kansas loss and the fact that they almost ruined our fun and almost ended up coming back and winning that game. But they were throwing all these graphics about what they were on the broadcast saying it was happening today, and I'm like, guys, that was 2019. That was definitely last year. I understand the confusion because it's basically copy and paste from last year to this year, and it's the same situation, but nonetheless, that was from last year. But the Big 12 shakes things up. The Big 12 gets all kinds of funky. Oklahoma loses. Texas almost loses. Oklahoma State wins despite all their injuries. The Mountaineers, of course, are losers. WVU now 1-1 on the season. WVU 27-13 losers to Oklahoma State. For Tom Bragg, for all of us here at WV Sports Now, for our full day of post-game coverage that's been happening here on Pittsburgh Sports Live, and all of us at the Now Network, for Cody and Esper 2. I'm Mike Asti, and the Mountaineers will go back home. We'll see what happens in terms of fans at the stadium. We will see what happens in terms of rankings within the conference and outside the conference throughout college football. We will see what happens in terms of news if they expand the playoff, or really just what happens overall. You'll find all of that at WV Sports Now. But either way, the Mountaineers do have some work to do. They do have some reason for concern despite some impressive performances. This is a rebuilding year, but it is a year with now a loss through 2 weeks and a year that is in jeopardy of some losses in the future that may not even look like great losses. So we will see. I guess I will leave that on this edition of the WV post-game show here on Pittsburgh Sports Live.